So thank you everyone for joining us today. I was just saying to the panelists, I think this is the 12th or 11th DRR live we've had. And today we're going to be talking about something that kind of doesn't really get spoken about a lot, and for good reason. You know, lack of data, a lack of kind of foresight of what's going to happen in 7 or beyond years. I've put together this panel to really try to understand what we would like to see in a post-Sendai world, and how disaster risk reduction needs to shift and adapt and innovate in a way that's useful to enable disaster risk reduction as a field and as a sector, as a research area, and enable us to help the communities and the populations that we are working day in, day out to assist and to provide information and research and knowledge for. So that's the kind of the overall aim of this particular session. Just a few housekeeping points before we go on. So I will be recording the session. I'm recording the session now, and it will be uploaded to YouTube for people to watch. If you are uncomfortable sharing your name or speaking on a recorded session, please feel free to ask any questions in the comment section. That won't be recorded. So if for whatever reason that's an issue, please do feel free to use that facility instead of raising your hand during the question and answer session. In terms of the question and answer session, because this is an online webinar, it would be great if you could just raise your hand, and then myself or one of the panelists will ask you to unmute if you want to ask the question directly. And as I've just mentioned, if you don't want to ask a question out loud, and you'd rather just put a comment or a question in the chat box, please do feel free to do so. And we'll make sure we're keeping an eye on those throughout the process. So today's discussion, as I mentioned, is really something that I think is something that's kind of really needed. So the Sendai Framework, as we know, celebrated its halfway point this year. We had the midterm review that happened back in May over in New York, and a number of reports and publications have been launched since that point, not least the political declaration after the midterm review, but also such things as the gender action plan going forward. And the midterm review was really about asking how we as a community, how society, how governments, how stakeholders can learn from the past 7 years of the Sendai Framework and try to improve on the next 7 years of the Sendai Framework. But I want to think a bit more ahead, go a bit further than that, go a bit further than 2030, and understand what kind of issues do we think will impact disaster risk reduction more generally in 2030 and onwards, and how the DRR community can prepare for and research and understand better some of those challenges. And I think it's vital, if you just look at the albeit short but still very scary list of major events, you know, just since 2015, I think we can all see and recognize examples of major incidents that have happened in such a short time period. And all of those incidents will have a direct impact and an indirect impact on how we respond to disasters and how we prepare communities to respond to disasters going forward. And I think a number of these things, such as the growth in populism or political instability, disinformation, etc., all have a massive role to play in how whatever replaces the Sendai Framework in 2030 onwards needs to answer, and how we as practitioners and researchers and academics need to explore that. So I'm really happy to have four such excellent panelists with us today. I'll go through a few introductions shortly. But I'm going to use their expertise, their knowledge, and their passion, because they are all early career researchers. They're all very much at the beginning of their careers. And given that they will be the people who are framing the discussions post-2030, post whatever replaces Sendai, I thought it was really interesting to try and understand what they think of both what's happening during Sendai, but also what they were kind of aiming for and looking for in a post-2030, post-Sendai world. And some of the areas that we will cover today are technology, which can't really have a future-gazing session without including technology. Health, I think, given the situation over the past couple of years, I think health is a really key driver of how we respond to disasters. Policy and governance, again, incredibly important, as we've seen with failures on a number of other platforms and international frameworks, and also the idea of marginalization and marginalized groups in disaster risk reduction more broadly, and understanding how in a post-2030 world we might need to adapt and change how we do things to better serve those communities. So our panelists today, and apologies, I'm going to look at my phone because I have a memory of a goldfish, and all of them have such amazing bios that I need to remind myself of what they've done, what they've achieved so far. So we'll start with Miguel. Miguel is a postdoctoral researcher at the Smart Lab project at the University of Limerick. And his research interests are climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. And Miguel has also worked as a consultant for the Humanitarian Open Street Maps team, which I'm a massive fan of that organization. So it's fantastic to have you with us, Miguel. The National Water Commission of Mexico and the National Autonomous University of Mexico. So thank you, Miguel, for being with us. Mark is an urban designer who's currently pursuing a PhD at UCL IRDR, our friends at UCL. And Mark's work spans, I love this, urbanism practice continuum, including advocacy, grassroots activism, technical advisory, and policy. So really kind of very much focused in the urban space. And his research interests cut across African urbanism, urban governance, disaster risk reduction, and urban features. So again, Mark, thank you so much for joining us. Masuni is a PhD researcher at the Erasmus University Rotterdam, working for the International Institute of Social Studies. Again, huge fans of the work that they are doing. So thank you, Masumi, for being with us. And her research is based on lived human insecurities and the meanings of home for floods and erosion displaced communities in Assam in India. So really, again, very, very critical key work, and unfortunately very relevant given the period of the year we're in at the moment with monsoons, etc. Masuma is also a advisory committee member with the Platform for Disaster Displacements, which is an intergovernmental platform based in Geneva. And then lastly, but certainly not least, Tashara is a doctoral student at the Global Disaster Risk Reduction Disaster Resilience Center at the University of Huddersfield. And his PhD is looking at pandemic risk reduction and community participation. Couldn't be more timely if we designed it that way. And Tashara is also a senior lecturer in sociology and has been involved in numerous disaster research projects with international collaborators. So I think we can all agree that early career researchers, even though they are early career researchers, have a wealth of information and perspective that I think we'll find really useful during today's discussion. So without further ado, I would like to start by asking our panelists the first question. So looking from your area of expertise, panelists, how would you rate the successes and or failures of the Sendai Framework period so far? And as kind of a subsequent question, but also kind of an attached question, how has the Sendai Framework allowed for improvements or caused degradation of your work? So Miguel, if we could start with you, please. Thank you. And remember, you have 4 minutes to answer this question.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. I think your screen is black. I don't know why, but just as an advice, I don't know what's
Can you see the screen?
Yeah, like yours, like the one you are sharing right now.
Oh.
But thank you for the question. And in order to answer this question, I would like to mention that the Sendai Framework was the continuation of other frameworks, such as the Framework for Action for the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction in 1989, 1 year before, actually, when I was born. then by the Yokohama Strategy for Safe World Guidelines for Natural Disaster Reduction in 1994. At this point, we can actually see that the frameworks were still blaming nature about disasters. After, in 1999, was published the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction that was followed by the Yogo framework from 2005 to 2015, when the Sendai Framework was published, and when I was 25 years old. I made these kind of relationships with my age because I think it's interesting to notice that all these frameworks are somehow really young. And then if we look at the GMDAT database that has a record of the events related to disasters and the numbers of people that have been affected, so we can notice that the numbers of people affected by disaster decreased significantly from 2015, when the Sendai Framework was published, and year when more than 430 million people were affected by related disaster events. However, in 2022, it seems that there is an important increase that reached more than 180 million people affected, which is nearly 60 million more than the previous year. So therefore, it seems that numbers went down after 2015, when the Sendai Framework was published, but now it looks that they are increasing again. Anyway, we need to figure out what's going to look like in the upcoming years, actually. So in terms of numbers of events, it oscillates between 500 and 600 events per year. So there is no a decrease nor an increase, which means that we are now preventing disaster events, which is a pity, let's say that. So coming back to your question, how will I rate the success of the Sendai Framework? I will say it's going okay, because the number of affected people by disaster has decreased overall. However, I will say it's not doing super great, because we are not preventing more disasters. I work with the stakeholder engagement at different levels to enhance disaster risk reduction, and I can notice that even that the Sendai Framework emphasizes very much in prevention, there is still a lot to do. Stakeholders at the local level don't even know what the Sendai Framework is. They are responding to climate crisis because they are already experiencing the climate-related impacts. Then we really need to reshape the way that disaster reduction is being conducted by considering the inputs of vulnerable people who are at the front line, and who are often ignored and voiceless, because there are still no spaces and opportunities for their voices heard. And I don't want to give the impression that everything is going terrible. What I want to say is that we need to take more inclusive actions to consider youth voices, children's voices, women's voices, immigrants' voices, LGBTQ plus community voice, indigenous people voice. Basically, any voice of the most vulnerable groups that are disproportionately exposed to climate-related impacts. Of course, there are already some efforts that have been done so, but more than ever, we young and all generations actually must look towards that. Otherwise, we will live an even worse world than the one we got when we were born. And it's totally against to what sustainability is meant to be. So I will leave it there, and I will pass the floor to the
Great.
next.
Thank you. Masumi, can I ask you to go next, please? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. I think Miguel has already kind of set the floor, so I'll not repeat quite a lot of things. Thank you for the introduction, actually, Miguel. So kind of jumping straight to the kind of work that I do in terms of displacement and different kinds of, like Miguel said, marginalized groups and vulnerable communities. The Sendai Framework has been hopeful, I would say, in terms of bringing displacement into the picture, in terms of disaster-related, global frameworks. Previously, with the Hyogo framework, the the emphasis has been much less, but when the Sendai framework came, the kind of words used or terminologies used have been kind of related to terms like human mobility, displaced persons, or displacement. So in that sense of the term, I think it is very hopeful. But that being said, there is no global displacement indicator. Apparently, during the negotiations of the framework, different actors tried to kind of bring in displacement related indicators into the framework, explicitly, but it's not there. So we have to find out perhaps which are the targets or which are the priority actions that are related to displacement. And in that sense, the target B and target G, which is basically target B is people affected, and target G is related to early warning systems and relocations. Basically, evacuation is the word that is mentioned. So we can say that those are the specific targets of interest in terms of displacement, both internal displacement and cross-border displacement. And if you ask me in terms of success or failure, like Miguel said, it is very difficult to call it like black and white, but I was just kind of going through the Sendai Framework Monitor, and in the target B, out of 195, there are only 36 countries, which include in progress, about to start, about to be validated, those kind of things. And the target B is for people affected by disasters, specifically where their dwellings are affected, meaning the housing is affected, so it has many sub targets. In that sense, I think a lot of countries have tried to come up with their own ways of dealing with the issue. But if we go region wise, and if I'm saying like Asia, because my work is based in India, and generally within Asian context, in terms of bringing local or national level frameworks around the Sendai framework, that has happened quite a bit. That said, there are still very many gaps in terms of integrating displacement into the DRR frameworks, the global framework, basically, at a local and national level. And that is one of the key reasons, or you could also say one of the key gaps for that is that displacement itself is a very sensitive issue for different kinds of governments. So when that itself is not acknowledged in many countries, without giving examples, but so then there is no acknowledgement of displacement related to disasters. And then, of course, the integration of Sendai framework into development programs becomes limited. So that is one of the big, I think, issues that have remained. And the other thing is, of course, in terms of displacement and Sendai framework data, it has, different scholars and different researchers has been done in the last couple of years, which kind of say, even my own research kind of has pointed towards that data, missing data or data that is not reported, of unreported cases of displacement, where people live with family or friends and relatives, is something that we need to focus on. That will also inform the future actions, I would say. So yeah. So for
Perfect.
now, those are the few things.
Great, in that short amount of time. Thank you so much, Masumi. Yeah. Mark, can I ask you to go next, please? I think what I'll do is I'll raise my hands like this when you've got a minute left. Okay. You're on mute, Mark.
Thanks, everybody, really, for this session. I will be discussing this from the urban perspective. And really, I think the Sendai framework is a mixed bag. So there are, of course, failures or areas of improvement that can be strengthened moving forward. And also areas that is really, really helped in the urban space. The first is it's really amplified the place of disaster risk in development planning or in urban planning. This was not there before. So initially, risk or risk thinking was actually a normative kind of a normative function or aspiration that of course, we would say, you know, risk is part of the planning profession or the practice of planning, but was it even understood? But then with the Sendai framework, I think planners started to realize that actually disaster risks are a big thing for cities. Many cities are at risk of, as Miguel was saying, you know, climate vulnerability. When you talk of water stress, water scarcity, we talk of fires, earthquakes, and all that. I think planners did not, or even today, they still struggle to see their place. But the Sendai framework starts to bring that into the fore, or the core of urban development planning. I think, having said that, it leads me to another discussion that is emerging, that it's actually enhanced or fast-track the science urbanism nexus. Long are the days when urban planners were actually kings in city making. Today, I think there's a lot of collaboration between physical scientists and social scientists. People are seeing the need to bring community voices, to bring science. You know, I think we just saw what happened in Turkey, and people are actually saying that the government knew that so many years ago that would happen. And where I come from, there's a town called Nakuru, and the government is very keen because it's really at the foot of the Rift Valley. So they're really keen to integrate risk knowledge into urban development planning, and it's reshaping planning. So planning as we know it is changing, and it's changing policy, it's changing practice, it's changing training of planning. So I think, again, that's really so important. On the other hand, I think it's also changing relationships, especially between national government, international actors, and city governments. It's really weakened local governance. A lot of emphasis is placed on the state as the duty bearer. But now I think you know, there's perhaps an opportunity to rethink this in the post-2030 development framework and even the future of DRR. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And you finished 40 seconds ahead. So thank you, Mark. And last but not least, Tashara, could we get your response to that question, please? And let me know if you need a reminder of the question.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you so much. And thank you all.
And I'll put my hand up for 3 minutes.
Yeah, of course, I see you. I think I'm not going to give you kind of overall perspective of what is Sendai and the key points, targets, and all these things. I think all other panelists, they made my duty easier. Like they gave kind of a nice background. Like if I see the Sendai framework in a wider spectrum, like what I see, like even now we are in the midpoint. Now I see that if we eliminate the COVID-19 factor, like when we see the targets and the priority areas and all, it has certain kind of achievements and satisfactory like outputs, like in terms of you know, the countries, they have more or less you know, integrated the Sendai framework into their frameworks, and the countries have conducted their mid-reviews in consultation with other actors and all, and global initiatives, especially the data sharing, enhancing global and regional early warning systems, and sharing risk knowledge and all. So I'm pretty sure that you all might have a kind of idea with the, there's a certain level of satisfaction. But my concern, like when it comes to the pandemic preparedness and response, now I see in the framework, like the emphasis of the epidemic and pandemic was quite inadequate in several places. For example, the epidemic has been mentioned in 2 places, like one is under section 28D, the priority, under priority 2, the global and regional level kind of relation, and the pandemic is in 1 point. So I'm pretty sure when the Sendai framework you know, becomes the next stage of the Hyogo framework, the emphasis maybe was more or less on the natural hazards. but the attention to the health hazard is quite low. And it's not a surprise, but the COVID-19, we triggered the first case in 2019 December, and 2020 March, the WHO declared the global pandemic. But my concern is, like, according to the WHO records in 2018, the report which was on managing epidemics emphasized that between 2011 and 2017, there were 1,307 epidemics due to 20 transmissible diseases around the world. So, like, that is the missing part, actually. Like, it was a huge instances, like when it comes to the epidemics. Now, the lacking part of the framework, Sendai, is even there is no signpost for epidemic and pandemic preparedness, even though this has been triggered initially as a huge kind of issue in the field of the disaster risk reduction. And also, I see there's a missing connection between the certain areas, like when it comes to the Sendai framework. Of course, there are certain expertise in the area, like the risk identification, risk knowledge, and early warning and all. I see, Kevin, you. But the gap is, there is no proper linkages between the section, and there's no proper system to connect all these elements together, just to, make sure the implementation will take in a proper way. So that is one of a concern, like, if I reflect the perspective that the Kevin made initially, like posing the question, that is my answer, Kevin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tashara. And yes, I absolutely agree, I think. And thank you for being ahead of time as well. Both, not that I'm suggesting that Miguel and Masumi should have done better. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm just saying thank you to Mark and Tashara for being ahead. But no, it's fantastic answers, and I agree with all of them. I think, the Sendai framework has been a mix. It has been, some really great stuff, particularly in comparison with the Hyogo framework and the Yokohama framework before that. But I think, there is a lot for us to do. So that leads really nicely, would you know it? Oh dear, sorry, my alarm's going off. Leads very nicely into the next question that I would like to ask our panelists. So if we think about a post-2030, post-Sendai world, and we frame that within each of your respective areas of expertise, I wonder whether you'd be able to provide maybe 2 or 3 areas in which you think disaster research, policy, practitioner community needs to focus on. And I'd like to really kind of drill down into why you think they need to focus on that, and how you think that can ensure a more responsive, inclusive, effective disaster risk reduction landscape. So Tashara, sorry to go back to you straight away, but I'm going to go the other way than I went last time. So Tashara, if I could get your thoughts on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. If I use the same, the terminology that you in your question, to be more inclusive, responsive, and effective. Like, what I think is, like, so we need kind of a paradigm shift of the DRR, like from the macro level perspective, the micro level perspective. Like, my focus is whether we can strengthen the downstream modeling. Like, we need more the cooperation of the last mile, the community oriented or the community based. So this is more certain in the epidemics. Like in several our research, we understood that, like, not like other natural hazards, but several the communities, even in Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and several the areas. So according to our research, so they have survived, right? They were like the resilient communities. So sometimes we know that the COVID, like the pandemic, like COVID-19, is certainly this disrupts the supply chain, the restrictions of the travel ban, and the health service disruption, health facility damages, and the health workforce loss. So therefore, what we need is the resilient community. So that is one aspect that we need to go with the next level. And on the other hand, like you may all agree with me, like we need the thorough emphasis on pandemic and the pandemic preparedness in the next level. Not only pandemic, I think now the current research highlights the interconnection between the human, animal, and environment interface. So they say, like, the planetary health. So we need that concept in the next stage. Like now, the climate change, actually the climate factor is one key driver of the pathogens. But we need to integrate all these things, the human, animal, and the environmental factors together. And also we need to be more sensitive on climate change and the diseases. Like therefore, we need more emphasis in the next stage on the climate sensitive diseases and the epidemic potential diseases mainly. So therefore, like, for example, now, up to now, I think even the mid review says that there are certain countries, they have adopted epidemic into their DRR frameworks. Even in Sri Lanka, very recently, we did several project works, them to, help how to incorporate the pandemic into their DRR, the framework. Likewise, we need more work on that. And also in this area, I think we need to think the new oncoming risk and challenges. Now, so even the COVID-19 was unexpected. It was uncertain, but we suddenly faced that, and nobody, measured the magnitude of the COVID-19. But therefore, I think after 2030, the next Sendai level, we need more focus on the uncertain challenges. Say, for example, BZRN, biological, chemical, radiological, and nuclear, sometimes hazards. So we need to see the trends and the patterns, the world, the hazard interface, moving on to. So therefore, we need that, more concentration. And the last point that I need to add, after 2030, the post-Sendai, we need to think about the resilient primary healthcare concept. Like, for example, as I mentioned earlier, so the global pandemic disrupts all other sectors. So what is available is the facilities that you have in your doorstep, the more accessible health services, more accessible health infrastructure and all. So therefore, we need to strengthen the local primary healthcare concept. I mean, we can't keep eye on the global, the services and the regional health and network. Everything can collapse by a global pandemic. So we need that primary healthcare concept to be more stronger one in the next step. Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tashara. I know we've got some public health people online today, so I'm sure they are nodding furiously at your last point. Mark, could I get your answer to that question, please?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is actually where the rubber meets the road, really. And like you said, to help shape foresight. I have 3 points to make. The first one is really, I think we need a paradigm shift that looks at disasters and risks from a holistic perspective. Holistic here, I think there's a lot of reporting on the big hazards, the big disasters, but then we're not talking about the small disasters, the everyday risks, the very extensive risks that oftentimes are there, especially in the global south. They're what kill people the most. So I think it's important to have that view also, and then also try and move away from a single view to hazards. The way we look at hazards, we talk of flooding, we talk of pandemics, but then can we have a more holistic view, a more systemic view disasters? That would help us evaluate the impact, but also to make a stronger case for disaster risk reduction. I think the other thing that needs to be strengthened, I already started talking about this earlier, is the science, policy, urbanism, people nexus. It's good that we are bridging that science, urbanism nexus, but then there's still gaps with the policy and people. So scientists, both physical scientists and social scientists, do not know, and this is also the wider scientific community and the academia, which is also part of the scientific community, is unable to communicate their findings to the policymakers. So I think there's a need to have a better understanding of how to bridge this gap, how to build stronger partnerships. And here, I also want to say that we need to build more local universities. You know, of course, we are really, you know, calling for more knowledge, but the global north should not dominate this space in shaping the discourses, shaping the knowledges. I think we also need to ensure that there are partnerships between policy leaders, universities within their cities, and then go back to the people's voices in all this. Where are they? I think we already started talking about inclusivity. That's really important. But then the other thing which touches on governance is accountability. Who is the duty bearer? Who is accountable? If there is no enforcement, who is accountable? So we really need to start speaking these languages of defining the different roles that different actors play. The other thing, and this is something for researchers, is to rethink the development model that we have at the global stage, the discourses, the narratives that shape the post-2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, but also the DRR agenda beyond Sendai Framework is really important. And here, what am I talking about? Sendai Framework talks really about public-private partnerships, the role of the private sector, but we need to really ask, who is benefiting? How are these destroying institutions, especially in the global south? What is the impact of this in the long run? I think that's really where I would stop this, and I hope that this could encourage more debate. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. Masumi, if I could ask you to answer the question, please. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. I have a complaint. Mark has taken quite a few points that I wanted to mention, but I could see a lot of relations in the way we have approached this question. Actually, to begin with, you had spoken about governance, inclusivity, and pardon, what was the last thing, Kevin? Did you mention 3 points?
Yeah, so effectiveness, how the effectiveness of the next stage of disaster risk reduction.
Yeah, so I have a couple of points, perhaps 3, putting them thematically, and they kind of touch your points in a cross-cutting way. The first, in terms of displacement related, the relation of displacement with Sendai Framework, and if I can be idealistically imagining, post 2030, how it goes, is really, I would emphasize on kind of ways to find out or ways to acknowledge the informality of the processes. By informality of the process, I mean the informal ways of displacement. More than the reported number of cases, there are more and more informal ways, of displacement, and not once. We have data that suggests that people who get displaced once are likely to be displaced multiple times, and that is kind of also related to this other point of not looking at loss and damage from a very tangible point of view. Because as of now, we do have these mentions in the framework, and when people are implementing the Sendai framework at local or national levels, but when it comes to displacement or people who have experienced displacement, a lot of it is informal. People lack evidence, documentary evidence, that enable them to access entitlements or rights, not just from governments but also from non-state actors such as humanitarian responders as such. And I think in terms of in way ahead, if we think like 7 years from now or 10 years from now, the adverse impacts of anthropogenic climate change will only increase, and as we can see specifically from the Pacific Islands, for example, in cases of displacement, coastal erosion, river erosion, there is a lot of things to be done that are beyond these formal measures. So as a community, I think we need to figure out ways how to be more inclusive of people who kind of fall off the grid. That is a first very crucial point. I mean, and the second one is what Mark was talking in terms of holistically looking at the issue. I would say that, yeah, I would just say that as we move ahead, we need to acknowledge as a community, and even within the framework, the collaboration between public-private need not be of 2023 per se. A lot of the processes are results of historical processes like colonization. You know, in case of displacement, land titles and land, a conflict is a major reason. And in the context I am sitting in right now, for example, in India or in Sri Lanka or in Nepal or in Pakistan, that's a major reason. And colonization was one of the reasons. So as a community and as practitioners, I think we need to move ahead with that kind of a mindset and look at long-term processes of displacement, not just report short-term disasters, but looking at, as researchers, I'm saying, for researchers, people need to look at the issue of displacement from a more longitudinal perspective and not like a bandage response. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Masumi. Miguel, if I can get you to go, and then we'll go on to the broader question and answer of the audience. Thank you very much, Miguel.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So yeah, during the last years, I have been focused on disaster risk reduction. Then I have investigated different approaches that are considered by different researchers. And I can see that they include different areas to that we still have to include different areas to reduce disasters. Because so far, like now, it's kind of like very technical approach, I would say. So one of the most important areas I could see is important to consider more and more is social science. And I think it's related to what my colleagues were mentioning before, since we don't need to forget that reducing this risk, disaster risk, is very much about people and our relationships with the environment. Disaster risk is the product of variables such as people's vulnerability and capacity, and it may be triggered by natural or technological hazards. But in any of the cases people are involved, then we really need to learn how to approach and how to include them in a proactive way that ensures their active participation through the process. And I think that's very related to what Masumi was telling us, and also Mark and everyone basically in the panel. Another area that was really linked to what Mark said was, and I think it's very important to consider, is land use and urban planning. I believe it's already included in some regions, as Mark already gave some examples, but we really need to have a look and at the way of how we are planning our cities and what's the use that we are giving to the lands to be prepared for facing climate crisis. We may not have like so much time actually, since we are already suffering the impacts of climate-related events. Then we need to respond as quickly as possible, and it should consider different aspects such as cultural and ecological aspects. Land use and urban planning are very often done with a top-down approach, and also, as Masumi was telling us, like we have like this colonized way of like how these territories were organized. So it doesn't really consider local knowledge or environmental conditions. So they tend to represent particular interests and to fail for the grand majority that are exposed to climate-related impacts. And the other area that I was thinking about is like political science, which is crucial, since lots of negative impacts we are experiencing are due to political decisions, which are not based on science. And that's a really serious issue that we are facing right now. And then we should really work together with decision makers in order to understand their priorities, but mostly to make sure that decisions are based on scientific knowledge and consider an inclusive way rather than informative. This is the case of lots of public consultations, which are only informative and do not consider the inputs of the people that are exposed to climate-related impacts. And yeah, with this I will end. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Miguel. I think all of the points have echoed exactly what I was hoping to hear, and kind of there have been some really interesting elaboration on a number of those. So hopefully the audience has had time to absorb while the panelists have been talking. And I'd now like to open it to the floor and see whether anyone has any comments, any questions. We do have one comment that's come in. It's not really a question, but it's a comment coming directly to me. Someone made the point of saying health hazard experience needs more focus on past events. Risk governance is key, but with more proactive collaboration approach with the multi-stakeholder participation. So Tashara, Masumi, I think actually that applies to what everyone's been speaking about, and really kind of talks around this need for this kind of both learning from the past, but also trying to envisage what a future would be, where we can better help people, where we can better serve people. We have got a question that's just come in from Kanza, who's based at UK HSA. Thank you very much for your question, Kanza. So Kanza asks, is it recognized that global South countries are at greatest risk of disasters, brackets, particularly climate related, close brackets, but the power and finance sits with global North countries? What do the panel think it will take to get the global North to mobilize, or do we have to wait until the global North is significantly affected before we see change in investment? That's a good question. I would love to get your views from each of you, actually, because that's a really important question. Miguel, should we start with you, as you're unmuted already?
Yeah, sure. So actually, I feel like we're already seeing this kind of impacts on the global north as well, with the immigration, like massive groups of people moving to one place to another place. So if the global north doesn't want to cooperate with that, I think they are really suffering the direct consequences, right? Because people are going to do whatever they need to do to survive. So one of the things is that people are migrating in the way they can. So I think that's something very related to what Masumi was telling us, displacement due to climate change. So they have to look for safer places. So I think that's really important. Probably in the past, or it took longer years ago, but now it's kind of people are moving quicker and quicker. So and people in the global north are actually experiencing the impacts of people migrating to the country they live to. So I think that's really tangible right now.
Yeah. Masumi, do you have a response to that as the displacement person we're speaking to?
I think not a response per se, but the question that was coming, I was just thinking aloud actually. I think the person was asking in terms of financing, right? Like investment from global north. And I do agree that in the last over a decade that I've been working in the disaster research area, what I've observed that until it happens to you, it's a human nature. It's not just global north. I have been a DRR practitioner. It has been extremely difficult. It is difficult to explain to people that the earthquake might happen, so you should be prepared. It's very difficult. But that being said, I think the scene of the funding itself has become very tricky now. And in many of the countries where we call global south, the financing itself is not that accepted in a very linear way. A lot of it is also related to a lot of governments that promote nationalistic feelings, I would say. So funding itself is not a very, very clean, even if there are organizations which want to fund, not necessarily every global north organization would not want to fund. Even if there is a need there, there are difficulties even in the developing countries where a lot of the disasters are happening, be it displacement or health related. I think that's where the trick is, and we have to figure out ways of how to maneuver, because I am kind of in between. I worked for a couple of years and then I joined academia, so I can feel the tension in the funding business there, if I can use that word. The other thing in a positive way, which I feel as a researcher, is continuous collaboration across universities, like Mark was saying, like local universities, who, like as people based in global North universities, it is, I feel, our duty or responsibility to kind of reach out to researchers in smaller universities of our respective countries, write things together, write policy documents together. I know it's a very tiny thing when you look at it individually, but I do believe it will somehow help, maybe. Yeah.
Thank you. Mark, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question, and I was just thinking about it and wondering, what am I reading from this? Is it that the global North has this climate denial, that they think it's not part of it, part of, like, it's not going to befall them? I think that's perhaps coming from the kind of narratives we've had, and of course, when you talk of the politics of knowledge around climate and these narratives that, the global South is more vulnerable and all that. When we look at floods, I mean, just the other day we heard of floods in Italy. I think we see increasingly flooding in Europe, and the threats of countries like the whole of the Netherlands being destroyed by 2100. So I think it's very present. It's just that maybe we are at that denial stage and responsibilities are being pushed elsewhere. I think the other thing, and having said that, we need to decolonize knowledge and narratives around disasters and climate change. If we are really to summon collective action, collective responsibility, then that knowledge needs to change, the way we frame issues, the way we communicate these issues. And that means we have to also change the way in which news outlets report also. My last point on this would be around the political economy. The way in which we look at development needs to change. That savior mentality has to really change. We come in this as people who are sharing the risks, sharing the vulnerabilities. So we come as equal partners. Then that changes. So yeah, I think those are the things I would say to this.
Great, thanks, Mark. Tushara, do you have anything to add?
Oh yeah, the one thing it's good, like the Mark mentioned about the political economy. I'm really keen on that part as well. But if I say the health hazard, like the pandemics and all, like, I mean, it may be affect disproportionately to the north or south or whatever the context. But I am pretty sure, but like the COVID-19 and the big pandemic, nobody can escape, no matter whether it's south or north. But the issue, like the response and the preparedness capacities, are developed based on the financial and the investment and all. So we saw that the big truth during the pandemic, like some of the countries, they were deprived with the vaccines and the medicines and the other essential things, while some other countries, they're stockpiling the vaccines and the medicines. That was the bad, the bitter truth that we see. So in that case, I think I can't exactly say like how we can get rid of the investment and the financial issues that are prevailing in the north, in one particular region. But what I see is that everything again happens, as many of our panelists, they said, like, we have some kind of historical root causes, and we have some historical relationships, like, say, for example, the interdependency between the north and the south still. So sometimes in some context, the one part come in the center and the other goes to the periphery, and it changes sometimes in an interchangeable way. So we'll see that even I believe that we need to see our priorities. We need to change the people's attitude and giving them what we need and what we need for survival.
Yeah.
So that is the only thing that we can keep hope with. Yeah,
Perfect.
thank you. That's what I
Thanks,
did.
Tashara.
Yeah.
Kanza did add, so the driver for her question was that the UK plans to drop its, as I'm sure you've all seen in the news, plans to drop its flagship £11.6 billion climate change pledge. And they're also, decolonializing global health. So, there's these kind of conflicting drivers that are happening. I would ask you to comment more on that, but we've got one last question and we've got 3 minutes. So in 30 seconds or less, please, can each of the panelists answer? The person asked, Mark raised a really important point. People are disconnected from urban planning, policy, and research nexus. How can they be included more? Now, from each of your perspective, not just urban planning, but how do we think we can engage with people more and get that in 30 seconds, if that's possible? Mark, as the question was aimed at you, I'll start with you. 30 seconds.
So 2 points. One is the way in which we use language. So language is a barrier. I think that is one of the key things, and technology. Those are the 2 very easy ways to include people. Have narratives, demystify planning, and have people engage in the process.
Great. Tashara, from your perspective, 30 seconds, please.
Of course, the key message that I want to deliver, if we need the community and they are in the tech part, of course, we need to see what they really want. Like the many of the programs that we have, it's cosmetic, more or less. You are showing up that you have that interconnection with the community. Communities in the front, communities oriented, community approach, whatever it's so called. But we need to make sure, of course, we are going and we are running the programs with, of course, what is community need. That is the key concern that I have and I'm looking into.
Thank you, Tashara. Miguel, if I can get you to go next, please.
Yeah, I think we really need to make use of the communication tools we already have and try to set a more horizontal conversation with all the different stakeholders that need to be involved. Otherwise, we're going to be lost on what we look for. And I think that's kind of the key point, try to make communication clearer and, based on science. That's a point that I would say is really important. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Masumi, do you have anything to add to that question?
I think to include community as researchers, I would really hope that more and more research uses participatory research methods and right from the beginning. That's a very critical method, perhaps different kinds of methods that can be used and developed. In our way, we can try to be more inclusive and be more inclusive in the real sense of the term and not plastic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to my panelists, Miguel, Masumi, Mark, and Tashara. Thank you so much for your time and your knowledge and the amazing work you're all doing. It's incredible. And I feel slightly kind of optimistic, having heard from all of you, that, as early career researchers, as people who are going to be driving these changes in a post-2030 world, that we're in a really good place. As it's difficult, but I think we've got the right skills and the knowledge and the capacity behind us to be able to push this forward. Thank you to everyone who's joined today. And we will, as a group of authors, the panelists and myself, be launching a debrief paper on this particular topic over the next month or so. So please stay tuned for that. But thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of the morning, afternoon, evening, nighttime, wherever you are in the world. Thank you.